Hello there, and welcome back to our Orlando time-lapse series. As we started with the fire station in the last episode, in today's episode we will continue on that and finish it. Since we are still at the beginning of this episode, I wanted to quickly note something, and you might can hear it already on my nasally voice a little bit, that I'm again ill. It's not as bad as at the beginning of this year, but it's just very annoying, especially if you want to record a new episode and you have to talk about something and always your nose is tripping or something like that is keeping you away from that. I mean, here in Germany it's pretty cold still, getting around -1 to 2 degrees each night, but I think in some days it gets much warmer and maybe then the risk of getting ill is becoming much lower in the end. But at this point, let's get on with today's episode. So as I said, we continue now on the fire station where we stopped in the last episode. And so the facade is almost done when you look on the front side, but there are still some details missing, and especially the side on the building is barely finished. You will see that in a couple of minutes that on this building on the side you have their pretty big windows and they stretch themselves up to the trim of the building. And so the trim is reacting on that by implementing the curvature of the window in the trim area. And this gives the building, I think, a special dynamic. When you look on the side, you see this wavy line. So there's also another thing I like to add that I talked about in the previous episode, and that's about the whole arrangement of this site on the main street. All buildings that we built so far were symmetrical. The fire station is the first building that breaks out of that, mainly because you have now this fire tower on the side of it. And the position of that, I think, is pretty important and deliberate. I mean, ask yourself, why would you put something like that exactly on that spot? It can't be randomly, it has to be intentional. So when I see those facades on the main street, I always see them as those small arrangements of buildings. And in that way, they look to me like a storyboard or a comic book even, very abstractly. You start to read on the left side and finish the sentence or the page on the right side. And when you're taking and project this logic to this arrangement of those buildings here on the main street, it makes strangely sense, because you emphasize the end of this page by breaking the symmetry and position this fire tower on the right side at the end of this section of the main street. At least that's my interpretation of this area and how it feels to me. Therefore, I'm pretty hyped and excited to reveal or to find out what other motives there are that are still to come on those other facades and those other arrangements around the main street. Not far from here, in a couple of episodes, we will start on the other side of the main street. I'm pretty sure that the conception of this other side is completely different to this one. Or not, I don't know. I didn't see it yet, or I didn't look deeper into it, because, and there I want to get to another topic, I don't want to spoil myself too much into new areas of the park. You have to understand that those parks, they are huge. And even to this day on Anaheim, a lot of those areas that I didn't yet build, I don't know about them, how they look specifically. So areas like Mickey's Toontown, the Star Wars area, some areas of the Critter Country, and also parts of Fantasyland. And not to mention California Adventure. And the main reason why I decide to not spoil myself too much of those areas is just the enjoyment when you start on a new area that you don't yet know. If you know that area already, then there is a lot of initial motivation and satisfaction gone when you finally are at the start of a new area. And so I like to keep myself within that psychological trick, and this makes it much more exciting also in the end. For example, if you read a book or watch a movie, you don't skip through it and read only some pages and then you leave it for like half a year. What I like to do is work on one chapter and dig through it very deeply and know pretty much every word on this page. And it's the same thing here also. I like to know every little detail there is, and at some point, when I reached a specific point, I can move on and discover new areas. So at this point, let's get back to the build. As you see, I'm just building the trim of this building and where the curvature of the window defines this trim. For the trim itself, I used art pieces. I built once this curvature and then I scaled this curvature just basically 4 or 5 times. Then you have this hierarchy happening of having multiple layers there on the trim. And I think this is a quick and effective tip if you want to do something like that, that you just copy it over and scale it a little bit up, and there you have it. I mean, something like that in Planet Coaster 1 would be always very tedious and exhausting. When I'm thinking back to the main street of Anaheim, I mean, the windows alone there, I had to create so many variations out of there. And since you didn't have the option of scaling anything up or down, I mean, it's just pain. And so I'm even more relieved that we have now this option within the sequel. So at this point, the facade or the walls around the fire station are almost complete. We just have to copy over now the brick pattern, the window and the trim. So I kinda get into this autopilot mode where I don't really have to think anymore what I'm doing. It's just finishing off this facade. And I like this process a lot because you can make this building what I like to call a watertight, so that all sides that you are seeing it are enclosed. And that's just a vital part of this whole thing to make them believable. Because when you see that the rear side of those buildings are empty and hollow, then of course instantly you know this is a simulation. And this is also the plan for the next episode, that we make the 3 buildings that we built so far solid and watertight, and also the courtyards between them as well. And yet we also didn't care about the area between the railroad station and the Chamber of Commerce building. I think when we have that, then we can move on the other side. We need those areas pretty solidly here in order that we have the first half of this beginning main street. And so with that, I don't mean to tackle the backlot yet. The backlot meaning pretty much every infrastructure that you see behind every thematic area in the park that is required to operate them. And since we are at the very beginning of this park, I just fear that we would be carried away by not focusing on the main street anymore. And so that's the plan. First build the main street, like in the prequel, and after that we then apply the backlot. It's a much cleaner approach, and it gives us also the ability to view the main street as a main street. And this is so important when doing backlot, because you have to constantly check the big picture in the end, how it looks. And at least for now, you can't do that. You don't have that relationship between those buildings, simply because there are none. So in that regard, we have to stay patient. I mean, throughout the project, this would be the key word, to have enough patience in the end, just because it takes so much time in the end. And when I look back to where we started, that was on the beginning of November, and where we are right now here in February, then I think we made quite a decent progression. I mean, the majority of that time went into the railroad station, And so I think in the next 10 to 20 episodes, the progress will increase tremendously. Just because those buildings aren't as big anymore. They're constantly getting smaller and smaller. When we are behind the Emporium building, the buildings are rather facades. And you can see that progression already when you look on the last 5 episodes. Within those 5 episodes, we built the Chamber of Commerce building, the City Hall, and the fire station. Sure, we have to do a little cleanup after it, but you could kinda say 5 to 6 episodes. And when you adapt that frequency to the opposing side of the street, then we should have that side within episode 22. So I'm aware that you can't really break it down like that so easily. It might be one episode more or less, depending on the length of it. But nevertheless, it gives you a rough guidance how the progress will perform and develop over the next few episodes. And therefore I think, and that's also the initial point I'm trying to make here, to not watch the progress of each episode solely by itself, but rather see them as a string of episodes where each episode provides an essential puzzle piece of the core picture in the end. At least that's the way I look on it all the time since back to Anaheim. It's this vision that someday in the future you have this theme park fully built within this video game. And so I think it doesn't only apply to me as the creator of it, that gives me motivation to think like that, but it also maybe gives you, as you are watching, this extra amount of patience to know that at some point we will get to Cinderella's Castle, to Space Mountain, to Big Thunder Mountain, to the Seven Dwarfs Coaster, and even Haunted Mansion. So at this point maybe let's talk about something completely different. And I thought about this because right now it's just there everywhere and you really can't escape it. Here in Germany we have the next election for our government and we already voted, at least I did. And I'm so happy for the general public here in Germany that we have such a high votage of people that voted in this election. And I mean, regardless of which party in the end you voted for, I think it's just a great achievement in general that you have so many people here that actually executed this right of voting. And so for the last week or so, this constantly interferes also with my approach of recording this episode. Because I thought, okay, what do I want to talk about now in this episode? And so I thought maybe I should talk about the political situation right now in Germany. But then when I woke up this morning and watched a little bit TV, it comes much clearer to me that it's not right to talk politics here in this format or in those episodes. Think about what we are recreating here. It's Disneyland, the land of past, present and future. It's your land that you want it to be. And therefore I think it's completely wrong to bring now any political narrative into here or to tell you my political opinion of who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, or what the hell is happening right now. On one hand, I kind of find it important to talk about also what is happening in our world today, but I just think it's the wrong place, it's also the wrong format. And in the end, you as you are watching, you probably watch this because you are interested into either Disneyland or Planet Coaster, ideally both, and therefore I don't see the necessity here to talk about something like that. And in the end, when I would talk about something like that, there's also always the risk that I don't want to give anybody here a platform for any political narrative they want to drive. And I don't want those people to spread here any racism or negativity or toxicity. In any event of that happening, I would block them and report them anyways. But still, this channel is not about anything of that. It should be about recreating Disneyland. And therefore, let's get back to the build. So as you see, we fully enclosed now the fire station. The outer facade of it is almost finished. There are only some little things left. And for the roof of the fire station, I used art pieces. So for those 3 buildings that we built so far, we used art pieces for the roof. And the main reason for that is just the flexibility of that. And at least here on the fire tower, it's also just because you can't really create it with any other piece in the game. And therefore my hope is that they will at some point release something into the game that you can use for those roof shingles or those surfaces. I mean, most of those things are just planar surfaces that just need some texture on them. But since we are working with angled roofs, this doesn't really work anymore with textures, since you get very sharp angles on the corners of those roofs. So even a billboard couldn't help us anymore at that spot. And so far the only solution that I see is to use individual shingles for those roofs, like on the railroad station. I mean, on the railroad station it's fine, but when I imagine myself creating every roof on the main street like that, it's just absolutely nuts. And so there has to be another way. And until I have that way, we just stick to those art pieces, since I don't think they look too shabby and they look quite okay and aren't too distractful. So from here on I will just make some little details and add, for example, here now the balcony on the fire tower itself. And so I think here on the fire tower, this little detail, this little balcony, I think it's so crucial, important, because otherwise this tower would be so blank and there's nothing to look at. I think that's always the case when you thinking about making a detail on a building, that you think about those spots where you look, where your eyes will land on those buildings. And if you have a spot on your building that is pretty, let's say, uninteresting, then just make something there that interrupts this blankness. And for instance, this little balcony, there is really nothing functional behind it because there is no door to access it. It doesn't really make sense at all, but it just adds a little bit more excitement and variation about this building, I think. And it's really quite a phenomenon. This thing with the balcony, I saw that like after hours working on this building, and suddenly I went like, wait, this balcony doesn't make any sense at all. And that's the point, right? It doesn't have to make sense at all in the grand scheme of all those details. And I think that's a great lesson to be learned here, that you see so many things here that make sense, but also doesn't make sense. It's the paradox that they happen at the same time. It looks like it makes sense, but it also doesn't, because we are just so used to it to look like that, in reality maybe. I mean, this reminds me a lot of optical illusions, where you also have that happening, that your brain itself helps in creating that illusion, where sometimes things that are completely in a different color, when you look a little bit to the side, they look in a much different color than they actually are. And so your perception of that is tricked by like literally a test frame of the brain of what it thinks it should look like. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit weird for me to explain that, but it kind of reminds me like on that balcony. You have so many things around there that make sense, but the balcony that sits literally in front there very prominently on this fire tower absolutely doesn't make any sense at all. And so I'm pretty sure that we have this happening also multiple times here on other areas in the park. For example, the Cinderella's castle. When we are there later and when you take a deeper look into it, that there are certainly things that absolutely doesn't make any sense at all. But that's just the thing. It doesn't have to be real and functional to look like it's real and functional. It only has to make sense at a quick glimpse of it when you see it. Of course, if you take the time and look much more deeply in it, you will see there are things that doesn't make sense and look kinda odd. But who does that in this park, right? At the end, when you are in the park and experience it for yourself, then it's not only what you see, it's also what you hear, it's what you feel. It's the whole experience of this place. And within this whole explosion of things that are going on in this place, you will not care about this one balcony that it has no door attached to it. And that's maybe also what I'm trying to get along here, to just ask yourself who cares about that sometimes. I think I talked about that also in a previous episode, but like in Anaheim, when you see now this park like it is on the workshop, the first thing that you will see, you are amazed by all the detail it has, most probably. But when I take a look on it, I see so many areas and things there that are still not finished and could be added there and improve. And at least for me, I say then, well, it looks like it. There are certain things that I spared out just because it's impossible to do. And then I say, who cares at the end? Only I, right? Because nobody knows about those small little inaccuracies that I'm willingly to accept at this point. Like the color on the railroad station that I still didn't fix, right? At some time I have to update that. I mean, I'm quite unsure until this day how I can make an update to the workshop entry. So if anybody is out there that could answer me that, I would greatly appreciate that. So let's come back to the build. As you are watching, I built now this little bell tower on top of the fire station. In reality, you have there a lot more ornaments on it, but it's just in a scale here where I don't think I can add any more details with the pieces provided by the game right now, maybe in the future. And for the bell itself, I used like this triangular shape that is on one side round. And when you rotate that then around, you get this iconic bell shape. I'm kinda surprised that we don't have any bells in the game right now. In the prequel we had that. We had there the Western theme and the Pirate theme both had a bell. So as they said, if they are bringing back those themes, I hope that they will add that. So in a minute you will see me working on the side of the building and adding this iconic staircase. And at least for this side alley, it's an essential part of it that will give it the distinct look in the end. And therefore, when I say that, the question about the piece count becomes here less important and everything starts here with the floor, since the floor of it determines the width of the staircase itself. Normally in architecture, most staircases have a width of 1 meter, and that's roughly what I used here also. And just a little detail I saw when building, that you have this little pavement there, and then you have actually like a super slight ramp there that goes a little bit up, and then you are on the height of the central hub, and from there on you enter the staircase. So here I'm marking myself the lowest point and the highest point, and where I want this incline of the staircase to happen. And as a quick building tip, if you want to create a staircase customly, you just place your diagonal there and then you make one step of the staircase and position it to this diagonal. And then you can just copy over those steps and you have a perfect staircase at the end. What I did here was even a bit more complicated than that, because I wanted to have the exact amount of steps on it. And then I had to measure out the exact height of the staircase and divided it by the steps the staircase itself has. And then you figure out the height of each step that you need for the amount of steps you have. Sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty easy if you do it once. So I also did underneath the staircase itself a steel framework where the staircase would be holed. It might seem a little bit crazy here, and as I'm seeing it, I'm probably reviewing this area. It just not make any sense to invest so many items there for a thing that you really don't see unless you are behind the staircase. But the most important feature of this staircase is the railing, I think. And it's also the thing that is most visible when you see this area on this side alley. You see on the right side like this little barn structure. I still don't know what that is. I don't wanna spoil me. And in the middle you have at the back side there this green gate. When there is a parade in the park, those parade cars will enter and exit from there. And at least for me, this is the justification for going so highly detailed here on the staircase. And not only the staircase, I mean the building in general, especially the bricks on it. Because when you see this corner on the fire station as a scene, as a camera preset, then this will give a beautiful look on those incoming parade cars. And by the way, parade cars, we have the ability now, when you place down a coaster or some ride, that you can attach scenery to rides. And that's one of the first things that I thought of when they announced this feature, to create those parade cars. I mean, those parades in the Disney parks, they are always a big occasion, and together with the firework, I would argue that they maybe are the biggest highlight there is. And therefore, it becomes very clear that we have to do those parades at some point. In the prequel, this was an absolute no, just because you couldn't create something like that. Maybe only as a 3D model that you import later on with the Toolkit Manager. Or the only other reason that I could think of would be to build that as a static element in your park, but this is the biggest downside, because those parades are moving. That's the essential thing about them, that they move through the main street. So I think this is possible now. We can do that. The only questions are how we do it and when we do it. I think it's far more advantageous for us when we do that very late in the project itself, or let's say at the very end of the main street, just because we will by then have much more pieces and variations of pieces in the game, but maybe much more importantly, the ability to animate every light in the game. Right now, at least that I'm aware of, you can only animate those event lights. And the thing is, when I now build a parade and I have on this parade probably thousands of bulbs that are very bright and also changing their color, and they fade from maybe white to blue or something like that, I want to animate that. And this is just currently not possible. And this was possible in the prequel with most lights, so I hope they will add that functionality. So in a couple of episodes we will start on the opposing side of this main street, and I wanted to try out there the horse-drawn tram, without horses of course, but I wanted to get into this attach scenery to rides feature a lot more. There are still some questions that I have regarding the scenery. The most obvious one would be, how can you save this scenery? Can you save it as a blueprint and reuse that blueprint later on a different ride? So in that regard, it's a little bit like the piston element, where you also get into some mode where you place something down and everything within this piston is then dependent on this piston. I don't know. It's just a question. How is it interacting with that? So at this point, let's come back to the build. The fire station is pretty much finished. There's only a little detail I add to it in a minute. On the right we have the green gate, which will later be opened for the parade cars. I then also place down those drainage or gutter elements that are on the side of the facade, as well as those round lamps. So the last thing I'm adding here are those squarish ornaments inside this trim area, and it's just one of those details that are so essential in giving it that distinct look in the end. So as I'm in the process of finishing off this fire station, I have to say that I'm very pleased and satisfied how the fire station looks now in the end, but also the entire scene that we built so far with the Chamber of Commerce on the left, the City Hall in the middle, and on the right side now with the fire station. It's a beautiful trio of different architecture, forms and styles that blend so well together in their unique layout here at the very beginning of the park. With that said, I want to conclude today's episode. We managed to finish the fire station, and with that pretty much the entire left of this main street. There are still a lot of things that we need to add, especially those two courtyards and the area between the railroad station and the Chamber of Commerce building. So those things are the topic of the next episodes, and after that we will switch to the opposing side of the main street. I hope you enjoyed it today. If you did, subscribe, like or comment, join our Discord server, watch my videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.